Hello, geometry students. Welcome to lesson 6. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at pairs of angles and things that we know about certain pairs of angles, whether they're congruent, whether they add up to certain degree measures. That's what we're going to be looking at in this lesson. And we're going to start off with two of the most familiar pairs of angles that we can identify. The first pair of angles is a pair of complementary angles. Two angles are complementary if when you add them together, they make a right angle or a 90-degree angle. So if you're told that two angles are complementary and you know the measure of one angle, you can simply subtract that measure from 90 to find the measure of the angle because both angles have to add to 90 degrees. So you got to remember complementary angles means 90 degrees. Supplementary angles means 180 degrees. Two angles are supplementary if the sum of their measures is a straight angle or 180 degrees. And here again, in the image, you see on the left, there's a picture of two angles, ABC and CBD, that are complementary. On the right are two angles, PQR and RQS, that are supplementary. You see that when you add those two angle measures together, you get 180 degrees. We have a couple of theorems related to these types of angles. The congruent complements theorem states that if two angles are complementary to the same angle or two angles that are congruent, okay, so complementary to the same angle or other angles that are congruent to that same angle, then they are congruent. Let's repeat that. If two angles are complementary to the same angle or two congruent angles, they're complementary to angles with the same measure as that same angle that the two angles are complementary to. That means that they're congruent. So in other words, because complementary angles have to add to 90 degrees, if you have an angle that has like a certain measure, let's say 30, that means that any angle that's complementary will have a measure of 60 degrees. And if another angle is complementary, it will also have a measure of 60 degrees. And if another angle is complementary, it's also going to have a measure of 60 degrees. So it's a pretty self-obvious theorem, but an important one. And the same thing works for supplements. If two angles are supplementary to the same angle or two congruent angles, then they are congruent because supplementary angles in the same way have to add up to 180. So if two angles add up to 180, let's say one of them is 30 degrees again. That means that the other one's 150. And then if another angle is also a supplement to the 30-degree angle, it also has to have a measure of 150. So those would be congruent angles. All right, let's take a look at some more definitions of angles. Adjacent angles are two angles that share a vertex and a side, but no interior points. Let's take a look at this diagram here. So adjacent angles would be angles that share a vertex. Like look at 1 and 3. Do they share the same vertex? Yes, where the lines intersect, they have a vertex. And do they share a side? Yes, the side between the numbers 1 and 3 is shared by those two angles, by angles 1 and 3. But they don't share any interior points. So 1 and 3 would be considered adjacent angles. 3 and 2 would be adjacent angles. 2 and 4 and 1 and 4 are adjacent angles. 1 and 2 would not be adjacent angles. We have another name for those angles we'll get to in just a second. But 1 and 3 are adjacent, 1 and 4 are adjacent. A linear pair of angles are adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays. In other words, they're adjacent angles that form a straight angle. Okay, remember the opposite rays language? We talk about how from the vertex we have one ray going out in one direction and one ray going out in the exact opposite direction. Those are opposite rays. They form a straight angle. If we have two adjacent angles that form a straight angle, we call it a linear pair. All of those angle pairs that I mentioned before are linear pairs. 1 and 3, 3 and 2, 2 and 4, 1 and 4, because they all make straight angles when you put them together. All right, now our other definition, vertical angles. Vertical angles are non-adjacent angles, so they're not right next to each other. Not adjacent, not right next to each other. Formed by two intersecting lines. These are 1 and 2, or 3 and 4. Okay? 1 and 2 are vertical angles. 3 and 4 are vertical angles because they're non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines. And those are very special angles because of one theorem that we'll get to in a second. All right, our linear pair theorem states that if two angles form a linear pair, they're supplementary. That one is self-evident because a linear pair makes a 180-degree angle. So if you have two angles that add up to 180 degree, that's the definition of a supplementary angle or supplementary angles, right? And what about our vertical angles? Well, the vertical angle theorem states that if two angles are vertical angles, they are congruent. So it means that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 up above, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. And I'll bet you're getting good enough at Saxon geometry to predict how that's going to work in the assignment. We're going to do some practice problems coming up involving these types of pairs of angles, and you can probably imagine how the problems for the vertical angles are going to go. That's what we're going to be doing next.